3 symptoms. That is all it took. Bleeding in the brain, bleeding in the eyes, and brain swelling. Doctors said it proved abuse. Courts called it science. But what if they were wrong? Parents are sitting in prison right now, convicted on medical evidence that a growing number of scientists say is fundamentally flawed. 1997. Boston, Massachusetts. A British au pair named Louise Woodward stands in a courtroom, accused of killing 8-month-old Matthew Eapen. The prosecution's case rested on 3 findings: subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhages, and brain swelling. Doctors called it the triad. They testified that only violent shaking could cause these symptoms together. The jury believed them. Woodward was convicted of second-degree murder. But here is what nobody in that courtroom knew. Across the Atlantic, scientists were already questioning everything. The case that seemed open and shut would eventually crack open a medical controversy that continues to this day. And hundreds of parents convicted on identical evidence. They were about to become casualties of a scientific battlefield. To understand how we got here, you need to know how shaken baby syndrome became courtroom gospel. In 1971, a pediatric neurosurgeon named Norman Guthkelch published a paper suggesting that whiplash motion could cause subdural bleeding in infants without any external impact. His theory was revolutionary. But Guthkelch never intended it to become an absolute diagnostic tool. Other researchers built on his work, eventually creating what prosecutors called the triad. If an infant showed all 3 symptoms, the medical establishment declared abuse had occurred. Period. No other explanation needed. Defense attorneys could not fight it. Juries trusted doctors. And for nearly 3 decades, this diagnosis sent parents, babysitters, and caregivers to prison. If you are just now learning how powerful this became, hit that like button. Because what happened next changed everything. But here is where the science started to fracture. In the early 2000s, biomechanical engineers began running experiments. And their findings were devastating to the triad theory. Studies using crash test dummies and sophisticated computer models showed something prosecutors did not want to hear. The forces required to cause the specific injuries attributed to shaking were far greater than any human could generate with their hands alone. Let me put this in perspective. The research suggested that shaking hard enough to cause the triad would also cause severe neck injuries. Spinal damage. Yet most diagnosed cases showed no neck trauma whatsoever. How could violent shaking destroy the brain but leave the neck untouched? This question haunted the medical community. And it was about to haunt the courtrooms. And then researchers discovered something else. The triad symptoms could appear without any abuse at all. Short falls from furniture. Undiagnosed bleeding disorders. Vitamin deficiencies. Birth trauma that went undetected. Rare genetic conditions. Infections that attacked the brain. The list of alternative explanations grew longer every year. Think about that for a second. What if the same symptoms that sent parents to prison could have innocent medical explanations? One by one, convicted caregivers began filing appeals. They hired new experts. They presented the emerging science. Some courts listened. Others refused. The medical establishment itself split down the middle. Pediatric associations maintained the triad was reliable. Biomechanical experts said the physics did not support it. And caught in the middle were defendants who had already spent years behind bars. But that is not even the worst part. Here is what the legal system refused to acknowledge. Some of these convictions happened in cases where no one saw any shaking occur. The diagnosis alone was considered proof. Prosecutors argued in circles. How do we know shaking happened? Because the triad is present. How do we know the triad means shaking? Because medical experts say so. This is where I need you to pay attention. In 2012, a panel of Swedish researchers conducted a comprehensive review of all shaken baby literature. Their conclusions sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They found insufficient evidence to determine the diagnostic accuracy of the triad. Translation: the foundational science was never as solid as courts believed. Parents were convicted on a diagnosis that could not be proven reliable. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed. The battle moved into courtrooms across America. Defense attorneys armed with new research. Prosecutors fighting to preserve convictions. And families caught in legal limbo for years. In some states, courts began allowing retrials. New expert testimony. Fresh examination of evidence. The results were staggering. Convictions that once seemed bulletproof crumbled under scientific scrutiny. But here is what makes this truly difficult. Not every case involved false accusations. Child abuse is devastatingly real. Some convicted caregivers were guilty. The challenge facing modern courts is separating genuine abuse from misdiagnosis. And that task has become almost impossible. What happened next shocked everyone. Drop your prediction in the comments. Do you think the courts got it right or wrong? And this brings us to the moment everything changed. Norman Guthkelch, the doctor who started it all, lived long enough to see his theory weaponized. Before his death in 2016 at age 87, he publicly stated that his research had been misused. He never intended his hypothesis to become absolute diagnostic truth. He watched as courts convicted people based on an extrapolation of his work that went far beyond what the science supported. Today, medical organizations have largely replaced the term shaken baby syndrome with abusive head trauma. But the fundamental debate continues. Some experts still testify that the triad proves abuse. Others testify it proves